Welcome, dear subscribers and curious listeners of my channel. Today I'd like to discuss how the Harry Potter films changed Severus Snape as character, softening his personality and adding some missing elements that significantly alter the perception of this character. Enjoy watching. Number 1. Snape and James. One of the key points that the films emphasize to portray Snape as redemption is his difficult childhood, marred by his relationship with James Potter. In the films, this conflict is reduced to a few scenes where James is depicted as the obvious aggressor, which is meant to evoke sympathy for Snape. However, in the books, their relationship was far more nuanced. James didn't just torment Snape, but also saved his life at one point when Sirius played a dangerous prank. Additionally, James disliked Snape for his interest in the dark arts. These nuances in the books add complexity to Snape, his portrayal as merely a victim in this story. Number 2. One pivotal scene. In the films, there is a moment when Snape protects Harry and his friends from Lupin, who is transformed into a werewolf in Prisoner of Azkaban, which is meant to showcase his heroism. However, in the book, this scene plays out quite differently. Snape doesn't display any heroism and merely loses consciousness from his injuries. He is also more concerned with searching for Sirius than with the safety of the students. This change in the films significantly alters the perception of Snape as a character who could genuinely evoke sympathy. Number 3. Snape and Voldemort. The films avoid delving deeply into Snape's past as a Death Eater. In the books, however, it becomes clear that after the tragedy with the Potters, when Voldemort killed Lily, Snape went to Dumbledore and confessed his actions, including his plea to Voldemort to spare Lily, despite his indifference toward James and Harry. This moment provides a much deeper insight into Snape, as motivations, and adds a layer of redemption to his character, which is missing from the films. Number 4. Snape and Lily. The films also significantly altered the relationship between Snape and Lily. In the scenes of Snape's redemption in the final film, viewers see a moment when James confronts Lily in the hallway and Snape watches them with displeasure. This was meant to create the impression that Lily and James shared mutual affection, which supposedly distances Lily from Snape. In the books, however, it is made clear that Lily initially defended Snape, but later turned away from him after he called her a mudblood. These changes in the films smooth out the complex and contradictory aspects of their relationship, presenting Snape as a more pitiable character. Number 5. Snape and the students. Throughout the story, Snape was an extremely strict and sometimes cruel teacher, particularly towards Harry and his friends. In the books, his relationships with the students were far harsher. He not only ruthlessly mocked Hermione and Ron, but also humiliated Neville, threatening his toad. In the films, however, Snape appears much softer, despite his constant favoritism towards Slytherins. His relationships with Harry do not extend beyond ordinary hostility, and his punishments seem lighter and less cruel compared to those in the books. Number 6. The omitted scene with Pettigrew. In Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, one particularly cruel moment highlights Snape's true nature. When Peter Pettigrew, disguised as Ron as Pet Rat, is hiding at Malfoy Manor, Snape repeatedly humiliates him. He forces Pettigrew to act as his servant, ordering him to fetch wine like a submissive lackey. Quote 1. Snape commands coldly, treating him with utter disdain. This scene is more than just a power struggle, it's a glimpse into Snape's sadistic side. Despite his professed remorse and supposed redemption, Snape revels in having power over someone weaker, using Pettigrew as an emotional punching bag. It's an act of cruelty, a way for Snape to assert control and project his bitterness onto someone vulnerable. However, in the films, this dynamic is entirely absent. Snape's interactions with his fellow Death Eaters, including Pettigrew, are sanitized, leaving out any displays of his arrogance and maliciousness. The audience never sees Snape's cruelty toward Pettigrew, nor his tendency to bully those beneath him. This omission erases a critical part of Snape's character, his ability to be both a victim and a perpetrator of abuse. In the films, Snape's moral ambiguity is softened, making him appear more heroic and less like the complex anti-hero he truly is in the books. Without these darker moments, Snape's character becomes less conflicted, more straightforward, and ultimately more sympathetic, removing the harsh edges that made him one of the most compelling and morally complicated figures in the series. Number 7, his attitude toward Harry until the very end. The final moment in the Harry Potter series where Harry weeps over Snape's body and later names his son after him is undeniably emotional. It's a moment of redemption, a tearful realization of Snape's true role in protecting him. Yet this scene glosses over the reality of their relationship in the books. Up until his death, Snape continued to belittle and torment Harry. Despite the immense sacrifices Snape made, his hatred for Harry, rooted in his disdain for James Potter, never truly softened. Even as he passed away, Snape's interactions with Harry remained charged with animosity. "You have your mother's eyes," Snape tells him, but the words are not a simple admission of love. They are layered with a complex mixture of guilt and unresolved anger. The films, however, present a much more heroic image of Snape. They portray him as a noble martyr, a man who loved Lily Potter, saved Harry, and was a victim of circumstance. This portrayal simplifies Snape's character, turning him into a figure of sympathy rather than complexity. In the books, Snape's feelings are far more complicated. His decision to protect Harry was not born out of love, but out of guilt and the need to honor a promise made to Dumbledore. Snape's actions, though ultimately heroic, were driven by his sense of responsibility, not a transformation into a selfless saint. The films erase these nuances, presenting a cleaner, more idealized version of Snape that doesn't fully capture the painful internal struggle he endured. Number 8. The excluded scene with Ginny. In Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, one of the most painful moments comes when Snape humiliates Ginny Weasley in front of the entire class. During a potions lesson, Ginny is injured, but instead of showing any concern, Snape mocks her. Quote, he sneers, his voice dripping with disdain. His words are not just cruel, they are an attempt to belittle her in front of her peers, to remind her of her place. This moment is a stark reminder of Snape's deep-seated prejudice against anyone who doesn't belong to Slytherin, and his willingness to exploit any weakness in students from other houses. However, this scene is entirely omitted from the films. In fact, Snape's interactions with Ginny are barely acknowledged on screen. The films choose to ignore how deeply Snape's bias affects his behavior with students outside Slytherin. Instead of showcasing his cruelty, the films allow Snape's character to appear more neutral or even professional in his dealings with the other students. By removing these moments of outright bullying, the films sanitize Snape as character, making him seem less malicious and more like a complex teacher with a hidden agenda. This decision to omit such scenes diminishes the impact of Snape as character. In the books, his prejudices are not limited to his relationship with Harry. They extend to everyone who isn't in Slytherin. His cruelty towards Ginny, a younger student, highlights just how far his animosity runs. It's not just about enforcing discipline, it's about creating an atmosphere of fear and insecurity. By cutting this scene from the films, the filmmakers reduce the severity of Snape's character flaws, making it harder for the audience to fully understand the depth of his cruelty. This omission softens his impact, removing the visceral sense of his disdain for anyone outside his favored house. Number 9, a shadow over Hermione. In Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, Snape's cruelty towards Hermione reaches a new low. One night he catches her and Harry sneaking out of Gryffindor Tower and takes 50 points from their house. "I would have thought you'd have better sense, Miss Granger," Snape sneers. The punishment isn't just about discipline. It's about humiliating Hermione and stripping her of the house, his hard-earned points. This moment isn't just a teacher enforcing rules. It's a calculated act to crush their chances of winning the House Cup. Snape doesn't just punish, he revels in the power of bringing them down, showing his deep-seated desire to hurt them, especially when they are at their most vulnerable. In the films, this moment is completely omitted. Snape's cruelty towards Hermione is watered down, instead of the harsh, vindictive behavior that is present in the books. The films offer a more neutral portrayal. In one scene, he makes a sarcastic remark about Hermione's teeth, but it's delivered with a wink, more of a sly comment than an act of cruelty. The films avoid showing the darker side of Snape's character, preferring to portray him as a grumpy but somewhat lovable figure, where his sarcasm is more like sharp humor than bullying. The personal attacks, the cruelty aimed at Hermione's insecurity, are hidden in favor of creating a character who feels less threatening to the audience. This shift in Snape's portrayal reveals a clear effort by the films to make him more palatable to viewers. In the books, his behavior towards Hermione is not just dismissive, but downright mean-spirited. His actions undermine her at every turn, reinforcing his role as a figure of authority who uses his power to belittle others. In the films, however, these moments are softened, stripped of the harshness that characterizes Snape's true nature in the books. His cruelty is downplayed, and instead of a teacher who is truly malicious, Snape is presented as a figure of dark humor, a necessary villain, but not one who crosses the line into outright bullying. This change shifts the dynamic of his character, making him less threatening and more of an obstacle to be overcome, rather than a deeply flawed individual. Number 10. The simplified conflict with Sirius. In Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, the animosity between Severus Snape and Sirius Black runs deep. They've hated each other for years, their rivalry rooted in their past at Hogwarts. When Sirius escapes from the house, Snape wastes no time in betraying him. "You will never be able to resist the temptation to be a hero, will you?" Snape sneers at Sirius during their tense confrontation. This hatred isn't just petty, it is personal. Snape's resentment towards Sirius is tied to years of insults, public humiliation, and a fierce rivalry that has shaped both of their lives. Snape is relentless in his bitterness, convinced that his old enemy deserves to suffer for his past actions. The films, however, reduce this complex conflict to a few fleeting moments. The depth of their hatred is barely explored. Instead of showing the long-standing bitterness between Snape and Sirius, we only see brief exchanges filled with snide remarks. The films remove the emotional weight of their rivalry, making it seem as though Snape's loathing of Sirius is just another passing annoyance. In one scene, they exchange sharp words, but the tension is hardly tangible. The films gloss over the emotional scars, the old grudges, and the desire for revenge that drives Snape as every action when it comes to Sirius. This simplification robs the audience of the true animosity that defines their relationship in the books. By stripping away the complexities of their conflict, the films paint a less nuanced picture of Snape's character. In the book, his hatred for Sirius is not just a reaction to past insults, but a deep-seated obsession with revenge. Snape isn't merely reacting to an old rivalry, he's consumed by it. His betrayal of Sirius, while seemingly an act of professional duty, also serves to settle a score from years of enmity. The films fail to capture how deeply personal this feud is to Snape, reducing him to a mere antagonist with little depth. Instead of seeing a man driven by hurt and resentment, the films turn Snape into a victim of circumstance, stripping away the intricacies that make his character so compelling. Number 11. Disregard for children in distress. In Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, Severus Snape's indifference to the suffering of students becomes painfully evident. During a lesson, Marcus Belby, a student in his class, is found with a black eye. The injury is a direct result of a bullying incident, yet Snape's reaction is cold and dismissive. Instead of showing concern for his students' well-being, he merely says, "Next time you'd better dodge." There is no empathy, no attempt to inquire about how Belby got hurt. Snape's response is chilling in its apathy, highlighting his lack of care for the safety of those who are not in Slytherin. For him, the suffering of non-Slytherin students is irrelevant. The films, however, completely sidestep this aspect of Snape's character. Instead of showcasing his cruelty, they portray him as a teacher with a sense of duty, albeit a strict one. The audience sees Snape as a disciplinarian who enforces rules, but his harshness is framed as professional, not personal. There is no exploration of his utter disregard for the welfare of his students, especially those who belong to rival houses. This omission makes Snape appear far more compassionate in the films than he actually is in the books, where his lack of moral responsibility is clear. By removing these moments of neglect, the films present a sanitized version of Snape. The complex, morally grey character from the books who can stand by while his students are harmed is replaced with a more conventional, albeit stern, educator. In the films, Snape's interactions with students are focused on his professional role, leaving out the darker layers of his personality. His cruelty, particularly towards students who are not in Slytherin, is muted, and his moral indifference is buried beneath the surface. This change distorts the character, making him more sympathetic, but ultimately less true to the source material. Number 12. Snape and Harry during occlumency. In Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, Harry's lessons in occlumency with Snape are far from ordinary. The first time Harry enters Snape's office for a lesson, he's met with an uninviting atmosphere. "You are here to learn how to close your mind against the dark arts," Snape sneers, his voice cold. Snape doesn't offer explanations, only orders. Every mistake Harry makes is met with harsh criticism. The worst part, however, is when Snape invades Harry's mind, rifling through his personal memories. Harry feels vulnerable, helpless, as his teacher violates the very essence of his privacy. Quote 10. Snape warns, twisting the knife deeper. The emotional distance between the two grows, and Harry is left feeling humiliated, a mere puppet for Snape's twisted lesson. In the films, however, these lessons lose their dark intensity. What could have been an emotional roller coaster turns into a mere spectacle. Instead of a bruising psychological experience, the audience is treated to a few flashy scenes where magic clashes between Harry and Snape. The heart of the conflict, the emotional and mental toll on Harry, is reduced to a series of sharp, magical exchanges. The underlying abuse that the book so powerfully conveys is glossed over, replaced by a duel that lacks real personal stakes. Harry, his discomfort, his sense of violation, fades into the background. In the book, the true impact of these lessons is the psychological torment they cause. Snape doesn't simply teach Harry, he belittles him, making Harry feel inferior every step of the way. "You are a disgrace to your father," Snape hisses at one point, cutting Harry to the core. Snape's cruelty isn't just about teaching a lesson, it's about asserting control, forcing Harry to endure emotional blows while also trying to train him. This constant undermining wears Harry down, pushing him to the brink of self-doubt. Snape's actions are not just about occlumency, they are about dominating Harry's mind in a way that is cruel and invasive. The films, by contrast, strip this complexity away. The harshness of Snape's treatment, his personal vendetta against Harry, and his methods of psychological manipulation are all sidelined for visual effect. In the end, Harry and Snape's relationship remains largely unchanged on screen, a few tense lessons, a couple of dramatic moments, but no deep emotional scars. The films fail to capture the emotional depth and psychological stakes that the books so meticulously build, leaving Harry's journey of occlumency a far less harrowing experience. The true agony of those lessons is lost, and with it, the real power of Snape's character. Number 13. Redemption out of love or for himself. The character of Severus Snape in the Harry Potter series has long been a subject of fascination, admiration, and even controversy. One of the most striking transformations in Snape's portrayal comes in the films, where his character arc is framed as one of redemption driven by love. In the final scenes of Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, when Harry discovers Snape, his memories, the tragic tale of Snape's love for Lily Potter is revealed. However, while the films certainly emphasize the romantic aspect of this love, the underlying motives behind Snape's actions in the books are much more complex. The question arises, did Snape's redemption stem from his love for Lily, or was it an attempt to atone for his own guilt? The films, with their visual emphasis and emotional score, tend to blur the more complicated motivations behind Snape's actions. By focusing on the element of unrequited love, the filmmakers present Snape as a tragic hero, haunted by his love for Lily and his ultimate failure to protect her. This view, while moving, simplifies his character arc and, in the process, diminishes the weight of his personal guilt. In the book, Snape's actions are not just about a lost love, but about a deep internal struggle with the consequences of his past mistakes, particularly his role in Lily's death. His love for Lily is undoubtedly real, but it is inseparable from his self-loathing and his desire for redemption. The heart of Snape's story lies in his guilt. When he first enters the world of the Death Eaters, Snape is a young, impressionable wizard who falls under the influence of Lord Voldemort. His actions as a Death Eater, including his involvement in the deaths of innocent people, are a source of immense regret for him. Snape's most significant moment of reckoning comes when he overhears a prophecy that foretells the downfall of Voldemort at the hands of Harry Potter. It is this prophecy delivered by Sybil Trelawney that marks the turning point in Snape's life. He is devastated by the realization that Lily, his son Harry, will be the one to defeat Voldemort, which ultimately leads to her death. Yet what is crucial here is not just his heartbreak over losing Lily, but his overwhelming guilt over his role in setting into motion the events that led to her death. In the film, the portrayal of Snape, his character in this moment, is more aligned with romantic tragedy. His grief is presented almost as a romantic longing for what could have been the love he was never able to return. In contrast, the book paints a picture of a man who is not only mourning the loss of his love, but is also deeply ashamed of how his own actions contributed to that loss. Snape's plea to Dumbledore, I wish I were better, reveals a man not driven by a desire for romantic closure, but by an overwhelming need to atone for his failure. It is this desperate desire for atonement that drives him to pledge his loyalty to Dumbledore, an act that ultimately leads him down the path of self-sacrifice. This moment is not about love in the romantic sense, but about guilt, shame, and the need to correct an unforgivable wrong. The films, with their more simplified narrative, translate this guilt into a form of tragic heroism. The notion of Snape's love for Lily as the driving force behind his actions is powerful and poignant, but it fails to capture the complexity of Snape's true motivations. In the final moments of Deathly Hallows, when Snape dies in Harry's arms, the emotional climax centers around the idea of his love for Lily as the redemptive force that transformed him from a villain to a hero. But in the book, Snape's death is not a moment of romantic fulfillment. It is the final act of a man who, though deeply flawed, has come to accept his role in the battle against Voldemort. He dies not as a lover, but as a man who has chosen to protect the world in the name of the woman he failed. The shift in emphasis from guilt to love diminishes the power of Snape's redemption in the films. By focusing on the tragic romance, the films take away the depth of his internal struggle and the real cost of his choices. Snape's actions throughout the series are not simply motivated by a desire to win back Lily, his love, but by the weight of his guilt over what he allowed to happen. This is evident in his interactions with Harry, particularly in the early books where Snape is openly hostile toward him. His bitterness and cruelty toward Harry, whom he sees as a reminder of his failure, are not the actions of a man consumed by love. Instead, they are the actions of a man who is still wrestling with the consequences of his past choices. In The Half-Blood Prince, Snape's commitment to Dumbledore becomes clearer. It is here that his motivations are laid bare for the reader, especially when he swears the unbreakable vow to Narcissa Malfoy, vowing to protect Draco Malfoy and, ultimately, to kill Dumbledore. This moment in the book is crucial because it highlights the complexity of Snape's loyalty. His decision to murder Dumbledore, which is framed in the book as an act of mercy, is not just a means of proving his loyalty to Voldemort, but an act driven by his understanding of the bigger picture. Snape is willing to commit an unspeakable act of violence, but only because he knows that it will ultimately serve the greater good. The films, however, simplify this choice by focusing on the emotional weight of Snape's vow, framing it as a tragic yet heroic sacrifice. The depth of his internal conflict and the nuanced reasoning behind his actions are lost in the process. Number 14. Forgotten moments with Dumbledore. The image of Severus Snape in the Harry Potter films is a striking contrast to the portrayal in J.K. Rowling's books, particularly when it comes to his relationship with Albus Dumbledore. In the books, Snape is a complex and morally ambiguous character whose actions are often driven by guilt, regret, and the weight of his past. The films, however, made a deliberate effort to soften his image, presenting him as a tragic hero rather than the morally grey figure he truly is. One of the most telling examples of this is the way in which the films handle his relationship with Dumbledore, particularly the pivotal moment when Snape is confronted about his motivations. In Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, the scene between Snape and Dumbledore in which Snape confesses to his role in Lily Potter's death is one of the darkest in the entire series. In the book, Dumbledore, with his characteristic wisdom, confronts Snape about his true feelings, telling him, "You feel guilty about Lily's death, but you still don't care about her son." The quiet, painful silence that follows speaks volumes about Snape's character. His inability to respond to Dumbledore's accusation reflects a deep-seated truth about his motivations. Snape's actions in this moment are not driven by any sense of nobility or heroic virtue. They are fueled by a personal sense of guilt and sorrow for the death of Lily Potter, the woman he loved. The truth is harsh. Snape is a man haunted by his past, unable to fully reconcile with his own feelings of guilt and loss. However, in the film adaptation of this scene, directed by David Yates, the moment is treated differently. The line, "You still don't care about her son," is cut, and instead the scene focuses more on Snape's tortured face and the emotion of the moment. In this version, Snape's silence is interpreted not as a confession of guilt, but rather as a sign of his tragic love for Lily. The film turns this conversation into a moment of pure sorrow, a reflection of a man burdened by unrequited love and the sense of having lost everything. The shift in tone makes Snape appear as a tragic hero who, despite his dark past, has been driven by an idealistic sense of love and loss. In the book, however, Snape's motivations are far more complex and less noble than the film presents them. The change in how Snape's character is depicted in the films can be attributed to the desire to make him more sympathetic to the audience. In the books, Snape is a deeply flawed individual whose actions are often contradictory and morally dubious. He is not simply a hero with a tragic backstory, but a man whose actions are motivated by his own sense of guilt, anger, and regret. The films, however, wanted to give the audience a clear sense of Snape as a character who is ultimately redeemable. By removing the uncomfortable truth that Snape's actions are driven by personal guilt rather than a higher moral calling, the films instead focus on his love for Lily and the pain he suffers as a result of her death. This tendency to whitewash Snape's character is further emphasized in the final film, Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, Part 2. In the book, Snape's death is a moment of tragic inevitability. His last words to Harry Potter, "Look at me," are a final plea for Harry to see him as the man he truly is, a man who sacrificed everything for a cause he believed in, but who, at the end of the day, was driven by a deep, personal loss. The film version, however, takes this moment and imbues it with a sense of ultimate redemption. Snape is portrayed as a martyr whose entire life was a series of self-sacrificial acts for the greater good. While this is certainly true to some extent, the film fails to capture the full complexity of Snape's character. The real power of Snape's character lies in his internal conflict. He is a man who lives with the consequences of his past mistakes, and while he ultimately seeks redemption, his path is not one of clear moral victory. His love for Lily Potter does not make him a better person, it simply makes him a person with deep emotional scars that he cannot escape. The films, however, portray his love for Lily as the defining aspect of his character, elevating it above the darker, more troubling motivations that also drive him. This shift in focus helps to soften Snape's character, making him more palatable to the audience. But in doing so, it strips away the complexity that makes him one of the most fascinating and tragic figures in the entire series. In the books, Snape's motivations are not simply driven by love for Lily, but also by a sense of guilt and self-loathing. He is deeply ashamed of his role in her death, and this shame is what drives him to protect Harry Potter, even though he has no personal love for the boy. Snape's loyalty to Dumbledore is not a simple matter of heroism or virtue. It is the result of his own need for atonement. He does not help Dumbledore because he believes in the greater good. He helps because, in his mind, it is the only way to atone for his past. The films, however, downplay this aspect of Snape's character, instead focusing on his love for Lily as the driving force behind his actions. Number 15, the final duel with McGonagall. In the final Harry Potter film, Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 2, one of the most striking sequences occurs during the Battle of Hogwarts. Severus Snape, a character whose morality has always been ambiguous, faces off against Professor Minerva McGonagall in a duel that seems to show him in a more heroic light. To the audience, this is a moment of revelation. Snape is no longer an enemy, but a man who has aligned himself with the forces of good. This duel, filled with dramatic spells and magical fury, frames Snape as a reluctant but ultimately noble fighter, one who fights only in self-defense, avoiding harm and violence wherever possible. The scene suggests that Snape's heart, long shrouded in mystery, is now firmly with the good guys. However, the reality of this scene is starkly different in the pages of J.K. Rowling's original book, Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. In the book, Severus Snape, his actions are less heroic and far more pragmatic. After Voldemort's forces begin their siege of Hogwarts, Snape is exposed as a double agent. Faced with the imminent collapse of his carefully constructed facade, he decides that the best course of action is not to confront McGonagall, but to flee. There is no grand duel in the book. Snape simply vanishes from the battlefield, not out of some noble desire to spare others, but because he knows his cover has been blown. He knows that he is no longer needed in the battle, and his departure is an act of self-preservation rather than sacrifice. This discrepancy between the film's portrayal and the book's reality represents one of the more significant ways in which the films attempt to sanitize Snape's image. The cinematic adaptation, eager to present a more palatable version of Snape, takes the opportunity to transform what was a moment of cowardice into a moment of heroism. Snape, instead of slinking away in a cowardly retreat, becomes a tragic figure who, despite his desire to avoid conflict, still fights for the greater good. In doing so, the film mitigates the darkness of his character, offering the audience a version of Snape that feels more redemptive, more aligned with the heroic ideals of the other protagonists. In the film, when Snape faces McGonagall, He is not merely trying to save himself, he is portrayed as acting out of some greater moral duty. The camera focuses on his face as he casts defensive spells, avoiding McGonagall. He attacks without causing harm. He is a man who refuses to fight, seemingly showing mercy even to those who are his enemies. This is in stark contrast to the Snape of the books, who, when confronted with McGonagall and others, has no real intention of protecting anyone. He simply disappears into the night, knowing that his role is over and that continuing the fight would be futile. His departure is neither noble nor grand. It is merely a recognition of his defeat, a surrender of his position. Moreover, Snape's absence from the battle is not merely a physical withdrawal, it is also a spiritual and moral one. In the book, Snape does not redeem himself with a last act of heroism. Rather, his exit is quiet and dispassionate, a reflection of a man who has been playing both sides for so long that when the moment of reckoning arrives, he is content to vanish. His absence from the final battle speaks to his complete detachment from the world he once sought to control. In this way, his escape is not a noble sacrifice, but a silent acknowledgement of his powerlessness. He has no intention of confronting his past or accepting the consequences of his actions. Instead, he chooses to disappear, leaving the burden of the battle to others. The film, however, reimagines this act of flight as a moment of internal conflict and self-doubt. In the movie, Snape seems to be fighting an internal battle as much as a physical one. The very nature of his duel with McGonagall suggests that he is torn between his old loyalties to Voldemort and his newfound loyalty to Harry and the Order of the Phoenix. This inner struggle is palpable in the film, his interpretation of Snape, his character. Yet in the book, there is no such inner turmoil. Snape has already made his choices long before the Battle of Hogwarts. His defection to the side of the Order is a calculated move, one he made long ago in the service of protecting Harry Potter. By the time of the final battle, Snape is not struggling with moral ambiguity, but simply avoiding a confrontation that he knows he cannot win. The film's portrayal of Snape's exit transforms him from a man who chooses self-preservation into one who chooses self-sacrifice. The way in which the filmmakers rewrite this moment of flight into a duel reflects a deeper desire to present Snape in a more sympathetic light. Rather than remaining the complex, morally ambiguous character of the books, the film opts for a version of Snape who is a reluctant hero, fighting to the very end, despite the fact that, in the book, he does no such thing. His actions in the film are framed as part of a larger narrative of redemption, turning his eventual death into the climactic culmination of his long-hidden loyalty to Harry Potter. Number 16, the distorted scene of Dumbledore's murder. In the world of Harry Potter, one of the most controversial and emotionally charged moments in the saga is the death of Albus Dumbledore. The tragic event which takes place in Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince serves as a turning point in the series, altering the course of the wizarding world forever. However, the portrayal of this moment in the film adaptation differs significantly from J.K. Rowling's original text. The movie's depiction of Severus Snape's role in Dumbledore's death, particularly the scene where he kills the beloved headmaster, is dramatically different, casting Snape in a much more sympathetic light. In the film, the sequence is drawn out with a long, tense silence. Snape approaches Dumbledore, who is already gravely injured, and in a moment of sheer emotional weight utters the incantation Avada Kedavra. His face contorts with pain, and the camera focuses on his eyes, which seem to reflect the torment of his action. This moment of hesitation is designed to make Snape appear as though he is struggling with his decision, as if he is reluctantly fulfilling a painful but necessary mission. The sequence, underscored by dramatic music and close-ups of Snape's conflicted expression, casts him as a tragic figure forced into an agonizing choice. The film, in essence, portrays him as a martyr who is burdened with the weight of his actions, seeking redemption through this difficult sacrifice. Yet the book presents a radically different portrayal of the same event. In Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, Snape's actions are cold and calculated, lacking the emotional turmoil shown in the film. He does not pause to reflect on his actions. Instead, he performs them swiftly and without hesitation. In fact, when Harry, hidden under the invisibility cloak, witnesses the murder from the top of the astronomy tower, the description of Snape's demeanor is anything but sorrowful. There is no trace of internal conflict in his actions. He doesn't falter, doesn't hesitate, and certainly doesn't express any remorse. Snape's face, as described by Harry, is not one of a man torn by the necessity of his actions, but rather one of distaste and revulsion. He is described as having an expression of complete disdain as he kills Dumbledore. Moreover, the chilling reality of the moment is not lost on Harry. As he watches the death unfold, Harry even has the distinct impression that Snape is almost enjoying it. This observation shakes Harry to his core. The idea that Snape, whom Harry has always viewed with suspicion, could take pleasure in the death of someone he had once served with such loyalty becomes one of the darkest revelations in the series. The stark difference between the film and the book is jarring. The film sacrifices the true horror of the moment, the coldness of Snape's actions, for a more sympathetic, heroic narrative. By doing so, it distorts the fundamental nature of Snape's character. The fact that Snape's actions are portrayed in such a different light in the film adaptation can be viewed as an attempt to soften his image, to prepare the audience for the eventual twist that he is, in fact, working for the greater good. The filmmakers likely believed that presenting Snape as a tormented figure would make it easier for audiences to accept his eventual redemption. After all, Snape's loyalty to Dumbledore is only revealed in the final moments of the series. Until that point, he remains a complex and morally ambiguous character, and the filmmakers may have believed that by showing him as conflicted, they would give audiences a reason to believe in his eventual heroism. However, this cinematic alteration overlooks the core essence of Snape's character as established in the books. In the novel, Snape's role in Dumbledore's death is far more ambiguous, and Harry's understanding of it is coloured by his own limited perspective. Snape's apparent cruelty and ruthlessness create a sense of distrust and unease, not only within Harry, but also within the reader. The emotional complexity of the character is not found in Snape, his expressions or actions, but in the larger, unresolved mystery of his true motives. To make him appear as though he is carrying out the murder with regret and hesitation detracts from the true nature of his character, which is one of quiet cunning and absolute commitment to his cause. In contrast, the film's portrayal reduces this complexity to a simple, emotionally charged moment designed to elicit sympathy for Snape. The cinematography, the close-up shots of his tortured face, and the musical score all work together to paint him as a figure who is suffering in silence, burdened by the weight of the responsibility placed upon him. This interpretation allows for a more straightforward understanding of Snape's character arc, He is a tragic hero, forced to make hard choices for the greater good. It simplifies a much more complicated character and message, sacrificing the ambiguity and mystery that made Snape such a compelling and unpredictable figure in the books. Additionally, by removing the sinister undertones of Snape's actions, the film loses an important part of the book's emotional impact. Harry's shock and horror at Snape's actions are meant to be a moment of growth for him as a character, a realization that not all is as it seems. The unflinching ruthlessness with which Snape kills Dumbledore is a reminder of the dangers of assuming that people are inherently good or evil. The betrayal that Harry feels watching his supposed ally murder the most beloved figure in his life serves as a wake-up call to the complexity of the world around him. By softening this moment, the film diminishes the profound impact it has on Harry, his journey, and ultimately on the reader, his understanding of Snape, his character. The film also changes the dynamic between Snape and Dumbledore. In the book, Dumbledore is fully aware of the pact he has made with Snape and has accepted his fate long before the moment of his death. Dumbledore's trust in Snape, his belief in his loyalty, is one of the key elements of his character. But in the film, this relationship is downplayed. Dumbledore appears almost helpless in the face of his death, and Snape's role as the one to deliver the fatal blow seems to come as a surprise. In the book, Dumbledore's acceptance of death is not one of weakness, but rather of great strength and wisdom. He understands the necessity of Snape's actions, and in his final moments, he asks Harry to trust Snape and to never reveal the truth. This understanding of the greater plan is what makes Dumbledore such a compelling and noble character. The film, however, reduces his death to a mere tragedy, stripping it of the larger moral and philosophical implications that the book so carefully explores. This difference in portrayal is significant not only because it changes the perception of Snape, but also because it changes the perception of Dumbledore's death. In the film, Dumbledore's death is presented as an act of cruelty, a moment of helplessness and sadness. The book, however, presents it as a self-sacrifice, a necessary step in the war against Voldemort, and a key moment in the unraveling of the ultimate plan. The film's portrayal, while dramatic and visually stunning, lacks the depth and complexity of the book, his treatment of the event making it a more simplistic and emotionally charged moment rather than a moment of tragic wisdom. Ultimately, the filmmakers' decision to alter this moment of Dumbledore's death and Snape's role in it is a reflection of the way they chose to portray Snape's character overall. By softening his image, they aimed to make him more sympathetic and to prepare audiences for his eventual redemption. But in doing so, they missed the chance to fully explore the complexity and ambiguity of Snape's character as it is portrayed in the books. The death of Dumbledore, one of the most pivotal moments in the series, is not simply a moment of drama. It is a moment of profound moral and emotional significance, and by changing it, the filmmakers inadvertently transformed one of the most compelling aspects of Snape's character into something far less nuanced and far more conventional. Number 17. Missing school memories of cruelty. In the Harry Potter films, Severus Snape is portrayed as a complex, tragic figure burdened by past grievances and ultimately redeemed by his secret sacrifices for the greater good. This portrayal, however, diverges significantly from the character presented in J.K. Rowling's books, where Snape, as youth, is marked by darker traits, including His early fascination with the dark arts, his association with unsavory characters, and his bullying tendencies. One of the most notable discrepancies between the films and books lies in the absence of school memories about Snape as cruelty. While the films emphasize his victimization at the hands of James Potter and his unrequited love for Lily Evans, they neglect to explore his own dark and dangerous inclinations as a student. This omission subtly alters the viewer's perception of Snape, transforming him from a potential aggressor into a romanticized, tragic hero. In the books, Severus Snape's early years at Hogwarts are anything but innocent. He was drawn to the dark arts from a young age, a fascination that led him to study spells and incantations that were both violent and sinister. One such spell, Sectum Sempra, was created by Snape during his school years and could inflict grave harm upon its victim. This dark spell foreshadowed the trajectory of his character, demonstrating his capacity for cruelty and malice even as a young boy. In contrast, the films choose to downplay these aspects of Snape, his personality, instead portraying him as a rather introverted and misunderstood individual who suffered under the bullying of James Potter. While his love for Lily Evans is depicted as central to his character development, the films omit the fact that his affection for her was not purely innocent. In his youth, Snape's obsession with Lily was overshadowed by his darker leanings and his growing association with future Death Eaters. The film's portrayal of Snape as a quiet, love-stricken boy who only experiences hardship because of James Potter. His bullying does not fully capture the complexity of the character, as seen in the books. In Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, Snape's memories reveal that he was not only a victim of bullying, but he also actively sought out friendships with students who shared his interest in the dark arts, including Lucius Malfoy. Malfoy, who would later become one of Voldemort's most trusted followers, is depicted in the books as an influential figure in Snape's life, shaping his ideology and his willingness to embrace the dark side. However, the films largely ignore this connection, focusing instead on Snape's tragic love story and his strained relationship with Harry Potter's father. One of the most significant omissions in the films is the lack of exploration into Snape's friendships with future Death Eaters during his time at school. In the books, Severus is portrayed as being very much part of the darker crowd at Hogwarts. His closest companions were not only future Death Eaters, but also individuals who would go on to wreak havoc on the wizarding world. Among these were Bellatrix Lestrange, who would become one of Voldemort's most loyal followers, and Narcissa Malfoy, Lucius' wife, and Draco as mother. These friendships suggest that Snape's early connections with the dark side of magic were more than a mere fascination, they were an integral part of his identity. Yet in the films, these relationships are either downplayed or completely absent, leaving viewers with the impression that Snape's association with the dark arts was more of a passing interest rather than a defining feature of his youth. Moreover, the films omit the more unsavory aspects of Snape's school behavior. In the books, he is depicted as a bully, using his knowledge of dark magic to torment others, particularly those he deemed weaker than himself. One of the most telling examples of his cruelty occurs when he targets Neville Longbottom, a shy and timid student who is often the subject of ridicule. Snape takes pleasure in humiliating Neville, displaying a sadistic streak that is missing from the film adaptation. This side of Snape's character is crucial to understanding his complexity, yet it is never fully explored in the films, where Snape is mostly seen as a brooding, misunderstood professor. By glossing over his youthful cruelty, the films remove an important layer of his character, which diminishes the weight of his eventual redemption. The absence of these darker school memories in the films also diminishes the moral ambiguity that is present in the books. Snape's character arc is one of transformation, but in the books it is clear that he begins as someone who was more than capable of cruelty and aggression. His experiences at Hogwarts were not solely defined by victimization. They were shaped by his own willingness to engage in the darker aspects of magic. This moral complexity adds depth to his character, making his eventual redemption all the more poignant. By erasing this aspect of Snape's past, the films present a more simplistic version of the character, one that focuses on his suffering and ultimate sacrifice, but omits the steps that led him to change. The films, in their effort to make Snape a more sympathetic character, also emphasize the idea of his unrequited love for Lily Evans as the driving force behind his actions. While this love is certainly central to Snape's motivations, the films portray it in an overly romanticized light, making it seem as though his darker inclinations were solely the result of his heartbreak. This interpretation is in stark contrast to the books, where Snape's journey is far more nuanced. His love for Lily is undoubtedly important, but it is not the only factor that shaped him. Snape's early interest in the dark arts, his cruel treatment of others, and his associations with future Death Eaters all contribute to his eventual path. By focusing exclusively on his love for Lily, the films reduce Snape to a tragic, romantic figure, rather than a character who struggled with his own darkness and ultimately chose a path of redemption. The films also shy away from showing Snape's role in the broader context of the wizarding world during his school years. In the books, Snape's connection to the Death Eaters and Voldemort's rise to power is portrayed as something that had a significant impact on his life even before he became a double agent. His decision to join the Death Eaters was not a simple mistake or a momentary lapse in judgment. It was part of a larger ideological shift that Snape experienced during his youth. This shift was not solely motivated by personal trauma, but by his belief in the superiority of the dark arts and the power they could bring. However, the films gloss over this aspect of Snape's character, opting instead to focus on his emotional turmoil and the internal struggle between his love for Lily and his loyalty to Voldemort. In Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, when Harry views Snape, his memories in the Pensieve, he is shocked by the depth of Snape's loyalty to Dumbledore and his sacrifices for the greater good. This moment is a powerful revelation, but it would have been far more impactful if the films had shown the full extent of Snape's darker past. The contrast between Snape's earlier cruelty and his later redemption would have made his eventual sacrifice even more profound, as it would have demonstrated the extent of his personal transformation. By omitting the darker aspects of his youth, the films miss an opportunity to explore the depth of Snape's redemption, which is one of the most compelling aspects of his character in the books. The films, while undeniably powerful in their portrayal of Snape as his later life, do a disservice to the complexity of his character by neglecting to show his darker past. His fascination with the dark arts, his friendships with future Death Eaters, and his cruel behavior as a student are integral to understanding the full scope of his character. By focusing primarily on his victimization and his love for Lily, the films paint an incomplete picture of Snape, one that lacks the moral complexity and depth that makes his eventual redemption so remarkable. While Snape's story is one of redemption, it is important to remember that his path to redemption was paved with darkness, and the films miss an opportunity to fully explore this journey. Number 18. No criticism from other characters. In the Harry Potter series, Severus Snape stands as one of the most complex and controversial figures. His journey from a seemingly malicious figure to a revered hero is one of the most notable arcs in J.K. Rowling's universe. However, the films, which adapted the books for the big screen, significantly altered how Snape was portrayed. The most striking difference lies in the almost complete absence of criticism from other characters. In the books, many characters view Snape with distrust, suspicion, and even outright disdain, while the films largely avoid these moments of judgment, making Snape's character arc appear less complicated and his eventual redemption less earned. In the books, several characters express strong reservations about Snape, highlighting his role as an antagonist, even when his true loyalties are eventually revealed. Nymphadora Tonks, a member of the Order of the Phoenix, is one such character. Throughout the series, she is wary of Snape's involvement in the group, and her feelings toward him are shaped by the widespread animosity he faces from other characters. Tonks, who is generally warm-hearted and trusting, is uncomfortable with Snape's cold demeanor and bitter nature. Her feelings are not unusual as the distrust of Snape spreads across the members of the Order. Even Arthur and Molly Weasley, two of the most compassionate and understanding characters in the series, are suspicious of Snape's motives. Molly, in particular, is blunt in her criticism of him, frequently referring to him as a manipulative, untrustworthy person who cannot be relied upon, especially after his apparent involvement in past acts of cruelty and deception. In the films, however, much of this skepticism is muted or entirely absent. While the tension between Snape and the Weasleys is still there, it is not as overt. Molly's sharp rebukes and doubts about Snape's loyalty are significantly toned down, with little room for the strong personal conflict that exists in the books. The films shift the narrative so that Snape's actions are perceived in a more neutral light, with the audience given a more sympathetic view of his struggles. The constant questioning of Snape, his loyalty, which is pervasive in the books, is almost completely absent. In the cinematic adaptation, Snape's enigmatic behavior is interpreted as mysterious or heroic, rather than suspicious or menacing. His actions are framed as enigmatic sacrifices, leaving little room for the tension that exists in the books. One of the most vocal critics of Snape in the books is Minerva McGonagall, the stern and principled head of Gryffindor House. McGonagall, who is fiercely protective of her students, especially Harry Potter, frequently clashes with Snape. From the moment Snape is revealed to be the new Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher, McGonagall's disapproval is palpable. Her skepticism is not without merit, considering Snape's history as a former Death Eater and his overt animosity toward Harry. McGonagall's disagreements with Snape are more than just professional differences. She sees through his cold, calculating exterior and is not afraid to challenge him, especially when it comes to his treatment of students. In the Order of the Phoenix, McGonagall openly criticizes Snape for his methods and his dealings with the students, especially Harry. Yet, in the films, McGonagall's confrontations with Snape are far less intense. While there are moments of tension between them, the films generally present her as somewhat more accepting of Snape, even though his actions remain questionable. The fiery confrontation between Snape and McGonagall in the books is much more emotionally charged, emphasizing their deep-rooted conflict, but this is downplayed in the films to preserve the more enigmatic portrayal of Snape as a hero. Hagrid, too, is another key figure whose disdain for Snape is not fully explored in the films. Hagrid, the beloved care of magical creatures professor, has always been one of Snape's loudest critics. He never trusts Snape, and from the very beginning, he's vocally critical of Snape's role in the magical community. Hagrid's protective nature, especially when it comes to Harry, leads him to view Snape as a dangerous and untrustworthy figure. In the Philosopher's Stone, Hagrid reacts with anger and disbelief when Snape is made a professor at Hogwarts, immediately questioning the logic of the decision. He continuously looks for any opportunity to challenge Snape's behavior, even when Snape's true allegiances are not fully understood. Hagrid's constant warnings about Snape are one of the recurring themes in the series, but in the films, Hagrid or Harry's protests are muted. His suspicions about Snape are toned down, making it seem like Snape's gradual redemption is more a result of circumstance than the result of earning trust from the characters around him. Perhaps the most significant element of Snape's portrayal in the films is the way the filmmakers choose to minimize his conflicts with other characters, which diminishes the moral ambiguity of his character. In the books, Snape is a master manipulator playing multiple sides throughout the story, often provoking conflict with the people around him. His role as a double agent for both Voldemort and Dumbledore creates an enormous amount of tension, with nearly everyone around him questioning his true intentions. The books present a nuanced view of Snape's character, where his motivations are always unclear, and his actions are open to interpretation. His bitterness toward Harry, his cruel treatment of students, and his involvement with the Death Eaters are part of a larger, complex web of actions that make him both a villain and eventually a hero. The books provide ample space for Snape to be scrutinized by his peers, and this scrutiny adds layers to his character. However, in the films, the characters' criticisms of Snape are largely absent or minimized. Snape is portrayed as a conflicted figure, but the films tend to focus on his moments of heroism, his role in protecting Harry, and his final redemption, rather than the many flaws and moral questions that are raised in the books. The films tend to present Snape as a misunderstood hero, someone who suffered greatly for his loyalty to Dumbledore and the Order of the Phoenix. This cinematic portrayal of Snape as a tragic figure who acted out of love and duty simplifies the character's journey, making it appear as though his path to redemption was smooth and inevitable, when in reality it was fraught with tension, mistrust, and conflict. By removing much of the criticism that Snape faces from his colleagues, the films risk presenting a distorted version of his character. While Snape's eventual redemption is powerful and emotional, the books show that it is a redemption earned through struggle and sacrifice, not simply granted because of his hidden loyalty. The absence of the harsh judgments from characters like McGonagall, Hagrid, and the Weasleys diminishes the complexity of Snape's journey, making it feel less like a difficult transformation and more like a predetermined outcome. The films, in their desire to simplify Snape's arc for the sake of time and narrative focus, lose the subtlety and intricacy that J.K. Rowling so masterfully wove into his character. In the books, Snape is a figure constantly under scrutiny, always doubted and continually questioned, not only by the characters around him, but also by the reader. His redemption is not only a result of his love for Lily Potter, but also a result of his willingness to face his past and confront the distrust and disdain of those around him. By glossing over the criticisms that Snape faces, the films strip away a crucial element of his character's depth, and in doing so, alter the nature of his redemption. In the end, the films may have made Snape more likable and sympathetic, but they also took away the challenging, morally ambiguous journey that his character undergoes in the books. The absence of criticism from other characters ultimately makes his transformation feel less earned, as the constant tension and conflict that Snape faces in the books are absent from the film adaptations. As a result, the films present a version of Snape that is less flawed, less complicated, and ultimately less human. Number 19. Simplified portrayal of Harry, the attitude after Snape seeked his death. In the Harry Potter films, the character of Severus Snape undergoes a significant transformation, especially in the final movie, Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, Part 2. The portrayal of Snape's character in the films is strikingly different from his representation in the books, particularly in the way Harry Potter reconciles with Snape's true nature and legacy after his death. One of the most notable differences is how quickly and simply Harry comes to terms with Snape's actions. After Snape passing, Harry's realization that Snape was one of the bravest men he ever knew is presented almost instantly, an idea that is stated with respect and reverence. This moment is a poignant one, yet it drastically contrasts with the more nuanced and painstaking process of understanding Snape's complex role in the books. In the films, Harry delivers the line, or quote 36, with a sense of finality. There, no hesitation, no long reflection, just a recognition of Snape as bravery as a hero in the end. This is in line with the film's tendency to wrap up complex character arcs neatly within the confines of a 2-hour runtime. The idea that Snape was both a villain and a hero is simplified into a singular heroic image by Harry, and this is especially evident in the final scene. The filmmakers emphasize the purity of Snape's sacrifice as he dies in the act of saving Harry and the wizarding world, presenting his life as one marked by remorse and eventual redemption. However, J.K. Rowling's original text offers a more complicated, rich interpretation of Snape's legacy. In the book, Harry's understanding of Snape evolves gradually, requiring a deep and painful processing of Snape's motivations, decisions, and the weight of his sacrifices. After Snape's death, Harry is not ready to call him a hero immediately. The revelation of Snape's true allegiance and his deep love for Lily Potter takes time to sink in. For Harry, coming to terms with Snape's actions involves unpeeling layers of bitterness, confusion, and finally, acceptance. In the aftermath of Snape's death, Harry doesn't simply forgive Snape's past mistakes or view him as a noble figure right away. Instead, he takes time to reflect on what he saw in Snape. Its memories and processes how this knowledge reshapes his understanding of their entire relationship. The book is full of moments where Harry's perception of Snape is challenged and revised, and it is only after much contemplation that he can see Snape's actions in a new light. After Snape's death, Harry is forced to reconcile with the fact that Snape's loyalty and bravery had always been there, but hidden beneath layers of anger and secrecy. In contrast to the immediate conclusion in the film, the book provides a much more nuanced resolution to Harry's emotional journey. Harry struggles with Snape's harshness, his cruelty, and his ambiguity throughout their time at Hogwarts, and it's only through the memories Snape leaves behind, that Harry fully grasps the depths of Snape's sacrifices. In the final scene of the book, Harry's reflection on Snape as a hero is much more intricate. Instead of simply accepting Snape's bravery as a fact, Harry reflects on the cost of Snape's choices. He realizes that Snape's courage wasn't the kind of heroism Harry had always imagined. It wasn't loud or obvious. Snape had lived a life marked by personal pain, isolation, and difficult choices, all in service of a greater cause. In the book, Harry's understanding of Snape is almost a moment of revelation as he comprehends the depth of Snape's commitment to protecting him and the toll it took on Snape's own soul. This emotional weight is not present in the film, where Harry's understanding comes too quickly and too easily. The quick resolution in the film removes the complexity that makes Snape such a compelling character in the books. Snape, as portrayed by Alan Rickman, is tragic, yes, but also deeply human. The book gives room for this humanity to be explored in greater depth. Harry's forgiveness and admiration for Snape is earned over time, not through a single line in a film that attempts to simplify the moral ambiguity of Snape's character. The films, by focusing on Snape's ultimate redemption, do not allow the audience the chance to question whether he is truly a hero or merely a man who made the right choice at the right moment. The line title quote 38, while emotionally impactful in the film, overlooks the profound journey that Harry undergoes to arrive at this conclusion in the books. Snape's choices, from his willingness to protect Harry to his role in Dumbledore's death, are laced with moral complexity that the films, in their rush to wrap up the story, cannot fully explore. By simplifying Snape's journey into a straightforward narrative of sacrifice, the films undermine the moral greyness that makes Snape's character so compelling in the books. In the book, Snape is not presented as a hero until Harry understands the full scope of his actions. The revelation of Snape's love for Lily Potter and the understanding that he was protecting Harry out of a deeply personal, almost obsessive love is a slow, painful realization for Harry. It is a process that involves Harry's grief, anger, and eventual acceptance. It is not a moment of clarity, but a journey of reflection and emotional growth that culminates in the recognition of Snape's bravery. Harry's understanding of Snape's choices is rooted in the notion that bravery isn't defined by one act, but by a lifetime of difficult decisions. In the book, Harry acknowledges that Snape's love for Lily drove him to make difficult, even controversial choices, and that this love, though it led to Snape suffering, also shaped his actions in a way that ultimately saved Harry's life. In the films, this deep emotional struggle is reduced to a simple, almost declarative statement. The films imply that Snape's final act of protection is the only factor that defines his character, thus reducing the complexity of his motives. By offering this simplified view of Snape's redemption, the films lose a critical element of his character, his internal struggle. Snape's path to redemption in the books is one of constant tension, secrecy, and inner conflict. He does not act out of a desire for recognition or for the approval of others, but out of a sense of duty, love, and an unresolved past. This complexity is what makes Snape such an extraordinary character, but it is lost in the cinematic adaptation. Instead of showing the weight of Snape's choices, the films offer an easy resolution that skirts around the discomfort and moral ambiguity that Snape embodies. In the final analysis, The films simplify Harry's understanding of Snape to avoid the uncomfortable questions about morality and choice that are central to Snape's story in the books. The films give the audience a neat, understandable conclusion to Snape's arc, but in doing so, they strip away the moral complexity and the chance for the audience to reflect on what makes someone a hero. The book's exploration of Snape's sacrifices is far more powerful because it allows the reader to wrestle with the nuances of his character, the price of his choices, and the painful realization that redemption is not always clean or immediate. Through this, J.K. Rowling gives Snape the complicated, painful, and ultimately heroic character arc that is at the heart of his story. Number 20. Idealized physical appearance. The portrayal of Severus Snape in the Harry Potter films is an interesting case study in how cinema can reshape a character's identity. The enigmatic potions master, brought to life by the brilliant Alan Rickman, presents an image of a man both fearsome and strangely compelling. His very presence on screen exudes a form of understated power. He glides through the hallways of Hogwarts in dark, flowing robes, his cold gaze enough to send shivers down the spine of any student unfortunate enough to catch his eye. The camera often lingers on his face, capturing the depth of his expressions, grim, sarcastic, but never entirely devoid of complexity. Alan Rickman, with his deep, resonant voice and magnetic aura, breathed life into Snape, making him an almost tragic, if not ultimately heroic, figure in the eyes of the audience. However, this cinematic portrayal is a sharp contrast to the Snape we meet in J.K. Rowling's books. In the novels, Snape is anything but charismatic. The description of his physical appearance paints a much less flattering picture than the suave, composed figure we see in the films. In Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, Rowling describes Snape as having, quote, 41, quote, 42, and, quote, 43. He is the embodiment of unpleasantness, from his appearance to his mannerisms. His very presence in the classroom is intimidating, not through any overt display of power, but through the sinister aura that surrounds him. The students are frightened of him not because of any specific malicious act he performs, but because his very being seems to emanate discomfort and danger. Snape in the books is a figure wrapped in ambiguity. The descriptions are more concerned with his ugliness, both in appearance and in his internal world. His physical traits align with his personality, which is far from idealized. He is portrayed as a man of contradictions, harsh, cruel, and unlikable, but also one capable of loyalty, sacrifice, and in the end, profound love. This duality is important in understanding the tension between the book's Snape and the film's version. The latter softens his unpleasant traits, rendering him almost, quote, or 45, in a way that Rowling's character never quite is. The key difference in the film's portrayal of Snape lies in the process of idealization. Alan Rickman's portrayal brings an almost romantic aura to the character, transforming him into a figure of mystery, depth, and even sympathy. There's something undeniably alluring about his character. His looks, with their calculated stoicism, become a kind of armor, a mysterious front that suggests a man who has suffered, a man with secrets. While the books make it clear that Snape's true nature is one of bitterness and isolation, the films craft a version of him who, though flawed, comes across as more tragic than malevolent. In doing so, they create an aura of sympathy that is absent from the original depiction in the pages of the novels. Take, for example, the depiction of Snape's relationship with Harry Potter. In the films, there is a growing sense that Snape's harshness towards Harry is rooted in something deeper than simple hatred. We see fleeting moments where Rickman's expression softens, a hint of pain flashing through his eyes. It's as if Snape, in his own way, is trying to protect Harry, but in a manner that only makes sense in the context of his own complicated emotional baggage. This image of a tortured hero is crafted masterfully by Rickman's performance, and yet it flies in the face of the Snape we encounter in the book. The book's Snape is not someone who evokes empathy. He is distant, cruel, and focused on his own schemes, rather than concerned with Harry's well-being. His actions, especially in the earlier books, often make him seem not just unlikable, but dangerous. In Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, we begin to see Snape's complexity unfold. In the book, his decision to join forces with Voldemort is not presented as a noble choice, but one made out of self-interest and fear. His betrayal of Lily Potter, the woman he loved, is framed as a tragic, selfish act. Snape's alliance with the Dark Lord is a result of his own bitterness and his desire for power, rather than any grand notion of redemption or heroism. This is a stark contrast to the film's version of Snape, where his actions are painted with a more nuanced, sympathetic brush. Alan Rickman's performance adds layers to the character, making his villainous actions seem not as clear-cut. In the films, the audience is meant to question Snape's true intentions, and Rickman's ability to convey emotional depth turns him into a figure of tragic complexity. The films also elevate Snape's role as a protector of Harry, especially in the later movies. This idea is deeply rooted in the cinematic need for closure and emotional payoff, a need for the audience to understand Snape's motivations. The book, on the other hand, is more reluctant to offer Snape's true nature so easily. His actions, though they ultimately reveal his loyalty to Dumbledore, are not easily explained away. His behavior towards Harry throughout the series is unsettling, and any positive actions are buried beneath layers of contempt and cruelty. Yet in the films we see Snape in moments of intense vulnerability and longing, as if to say, "This is a man who has suffered for his love and will redeem himself." These moments of vulnerability are meant to make him more human, to create a sense of pathos around his character, even though the book's Snape is much less emotionally available. Alan Rickman's portrayal also enhances Snape's mysteriousness in a way that the book doesn't emphasize as much. The films add a sense of drama to his every move, from the way he enters a room to how he addresses his students. Rickman's Snape is an almost theatrical figure, an embodiment of the Gothic hero, mysterious, haunted, and larger than life. His movements are deliberate, his expressions often unreadable, and yet they seem to conceal a vast ocean of emotion and history. This is a significant departure from the more restrained and plain-spoken character in the book, where Snape's personality is defined by his sharp tongue and cutting remarks rather than any grandiosity. The book's Snape operates in the shadows, acting according to his own code, while the film's Snape seems to crave the spotlight, even if that spotlight is tinged with melancholy. The film's emphasis on Snape's beauty, or at least his magnetism, is another striking contrast to the book's description of him. In the novels, Snape's appearance is described with revulsion, but the films present him as someone whose appearance, though dark and severe, is compelling. Rickman's unique features, his sharp cheekbones, intense gaze, and aristocratic air, are all amplified on the screen. Snape becomes not just a teacher, but a character whose every appearance is laden with significance. His movements are graceful, his demeanor commanding. Even in moments of anger or frustration, there is an undeniable allure to him, a presence that commands attention. The films play with this, making Snape a character who seems almost too interesting to be purely villainous. In this sense, the films change the narrative by transforming Snape into a Gothic hero, a misunderstood character who, despite his flaws, stands out as a figure of mystery and intrigue. This shift in how Snape is portrayed is reflective of broader trends in popular media, where morally ambiguous characters are often given an aura of heroism or tragic nobility. Snape in the books remains a far more ambiguous figure, one who is not concerned with public perception or the expectations of others. The film's Snape, by contrast, is crafted for an audience looking for redemption, for closure, and for a hero who can be empathized with despite his darker traits. In conclusion, the films do more than simply adapt Snape, his character, from the books. They reshape him entirely. Where the book portrays Snape as a deeply unpleasant, complex character, the film, through the charm of Alan Rickman, reimagines him as a tragic figure of beauty and mystery. The cinematic Snape is a character whose internal struggles are given emotional weight, whose bitterness is tempered with moments of vulnerability, and whose physical appearance, once repulsive, becomes an aesthetic choice. The transformation of Snape from a repellent figure to a character who commands both respect and sympathy exemplifies the power of cinema to reinterpret and reshape the identities of literary characters. Number 21, silence about cowardice in his youth. Severus Snape, a figure of great complexity and contradiction in J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter series, has undergone a transformation in the film adaptations that obscures one key aspect of his character, his youthful fear and cowardice. While the books provide an in-depth exploration of his motivations, especially in his teenage years, the films offer a more heroic, stoic portrayal of Snape, focusing on his eventual redemption. In the cinematic world, he appears less as a man shaped by weakness and fear, and more as a figure of strong will and unwavering commitment. However, this narrative glosses over the crucial point that Snape's initial allegiance to the Dark Lord and his general approach to life in his younger years was rooted not in conviction, but in fear. In the books, Snape's early life is defined by the struggle for survival in a world filled with bullies and potential threats. He was born to a father who was abusive and a mother who was passive, forming a deeply insecure foundation for his personality. The book Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince gives us a glimpse into his childhood and early adolescence. It shows that Snape was not always the commanding, assured figure we come to know in the later books. Instead, he was a timid boy, often caught in the crossfire of more powerful personalities. When he first encountered James Potter and his friends, he was an awkward and insecure child, desperately seeking validation in a world that seemed hostile to him. It was in this context that Snape's first encounter with the Death Eaters occurred. The films, however, shift focus away from the fear and insecurity that drove Snape to the Dark Lord in the first place. In Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, Snape is portrayed as a character who is solely motivated by noble, selfless reasons, even in his youth. But in truth, as seen in the books, Snape's decision to join the Death Eaters was not based on ideology, but rather an attempt to gain power and safety in a world that had seemed so harsh to him. Snape wasn't a leader, he was a follower, driven by the instinct to align himself with those who seemed to have the strength and power that he lacked. The fear of being powerless haunted him, and in a world where power was the ultimate currency, he chose to serve the Dark Lord in the hopes that it would give him a sense of belonging. One of the most significant moments that reveal this aspect of Snape's youth comes when he is introduced to the idea of the Death Eaters. In Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, Harry sees Snape as memories of his teenage years where he is approached by Bellatrix Lestrange and others to join their ranks. The young Severus is hesitant, almost fearful, when confronted with the offer. He doesn't possess the inherent cruelty or deep-seated hate for Muggles that other Death Eaters do. Rather, he's looking for a way to fit in, to gain some control over his otherwise powerless life. This subtle but important aspect of his character is brushed aside in the films. Instead, the cinematic portrayal of Snape, his younger self, is one of someone who has already embraced the ideology of the Dark Lord without question. The tension in Snape's early life is further explored in his relationship with Lily Evans, who later becomes Harry Potter's mother. Lily was one of the few people who showed Snape kindness, yet he failed to understand the importance of this friendship. His descent into the Death Eaters, spurred on by his desire for power and recognition, alienated him from Lily. The films present Snape's love for Lily as a pure, unwavering devotion, a driving force behind his actions later in life. But in the books it is much more complex. Snape's love for Lily is not the noble, selfless love he later claims to have, but a form of emotional attachment that is rooted in insecurity and the desire to possess what he could not have. His hatred of James Potter, born from the jealousy and bitterness of being rejected, becomes the lens through which he views the world. It is only in later years, after a deep internal conflict, that he begins to change, but the films, once again, reduce this complex internal struggle to a single, selfless act. This fear-driven behavior that characterized Snape's adolescence is also present in his eventual loyalty to Dumbledore. In the book Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, Snape's eventual betrayal of Voldemort is not portrayed as a single moment of heroic clarity, but rather as the culmination of years of internal conflict. His fear of losing Lily and his guilt over her death push him into an allegiance with Dumbledore, but it is never an easy or noble decision. Instead, it is a choice born out of deep regret, guilt, and the fear that he has irrevocably damaged his own soul. The films, however, turn Snape's decision into one of calculated nobility, omitting the messy, fearful emotions that were actually at the heart of his choices. His character becomes a symbol of redemption and loyalty, but this portrayal oversimplifies the complexities of his character, neglecting the fact that his motivations were often rooted in fear and guilt. In his youth, Snape was not a confident, assured individual, as the films often present him. He was deeply insecure, a product of his upbringing, who turned to the Death Eaters not because he was a true believer in their cause, but because he was desperate for any kind of acceptance. His relationship with Voldemort was never one of shared ideals, it was an act of self-preservation. His cowardice, the need to align himself with those who appeared to hold power, and his overwhelming fear of rejection and weakness form the foundation of the man he would become. This early, fear-driven mindset influenced his later actions, including his obsessive need for control over his environment and his relationship with Harry. In Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, Snape's attitude towards Harry is often one of disdain, but it is also colored by a sense of projection. Snape sees in Harry the same brash, reckless traits that he once had, and yet Harry embodies a confidence and bravery that Snape could never summon in his youth. While Harry boldly faces danger, Snape's youthful fear led him to follow those who seemed to have the answers. This fundamental difference is not explored in the films, but it is a crucial aspect of Snape's character. The films focus on his strictness and perceived cruelty, but they do not delve into his internal torment, the fear that once drove him to choose the wrong path. As the series progresses, Snape's transformation from a fearful follower to a tragic hero is portrayed in the films, but this shift in perspective oversimplifies the complexity of his character. Snape's redemption is framed as the result of noble self-sacrifice, but the truth is far messier. His journey was not one of heroic clarity, but one shaped by the echoes of his youthful fears. The films, in their attempt to create a neat, redemptive narrative, gloss over the darker aspects of Snape's character, particularly his early cowardice and his vulnerability. These traits were integral to understanding why Snape made the choices he did, and without them, his eventual redemption seems less like a personal transformation and more like an act of contrived heroism. In the final analysis, Snape's character arc, when viewed through the lens of his fears, becomes more tragic and human. His redemption, while genuine, is not born of heroic resolve, but of the gradual recognition of his own weaknesses and the desire to atone for the mistakes he made in his youth. The films, by omitting the nuances of Snape's early life, reduce his complexity to a simplistic tale of redemption, one that fails to capture the full scope of his struggle. The truth, as revealed in the books, is that Snape was a man haunted by fear and guilt, a man whose later courage was born not out of heroism, but from the painful recognition of his own failures. Number 22, lack of deeper analysis of his teaching failures. Severus Snape is one of the most complex and polarizing characters in J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter series. He is a man who wears many masks, and his role as a teacher at Hogwarts is both pivotal and deeply problematic. In the films, however, Snape is often portrayed in a more sympathetic light than his literary counterpart. While the movies showcase his stern demeanor and moments of personal sacrifice, they largely gloss over his failure as an educator, an aspect of his character that is profoundly important in the books. In the Harry Potter films, Snape's classroom scenes often appear theatrical, filled with intense, mysterious energy. He stands at the front of his classroom, exuding authority, and there is an undeniable air of gravitas about him. His lessons are carefully staged, and his strictness is portrayed as part of his charm, an enigmatic figure whose harshness is seen as a mark of his depth and complexity. Yet behind the surface of this commanding presence, the films fail to explore the toxic nature of Snape's teaching methods. His pedagogical failures are excused in favor of building up his hero's journey and his eventual redemption. This does a disservice to the true nature of Snape's role at Hogwarts. In the books, Snape is not simply a stern teacher with a hidden heart of gold. He is a bully, a manipulator, and a deeply flawed individual who uses his power over students to intimidate and break them down. For instance, one of the most striking aspects of Snape's teaching style is his blatant favoritism and cruelty. In the book, he does not engage with students as a mentor, guiding them through their mistakes and helping them improve. Instead, he humiliates them for their errors, punishing them harshly for even the smallest infractions. His classroom is a place where fear reigns supreme, and students live in constant dread of being ridiculed or punished. Harry Potter, the protagonist, often serves as the example of Snape's cruelty. On more than one occasion, Snape insults Harry in front of the class, mocking him for being clumsy and incompetent, when, in reality, it is Snape who is to blame for creating an environment where Harry feels alienated and unsupported. This mistreatment is not just limited to Harry. Students like Hermione Granger and Neville Longbottom also suffer under Snape's harsh regime. Hermione, despite her brilliant intellect and dedication to learning, is belittled for her enthusiasm and her frequent perfectionism. Snape consistently undermines her, dismissing her contributions and at times mocking her attempts to show her knowledge. Neville, on the other hand, is ridiculed for his lack of confidence and his failure to live up to Snape's impossible standards. His experiences in Snape's class are a direct contrast to the encouraging mentorship he receives from teachers like Professor Sprout or even Professor Lupin. While these teachers help Neville grow in confidence and ability, Snape's treatment crushes him further, cementing his fear and self-doubt. One of the most disturbing aspects of Snape's pedagogy is how he uses his position as a teacher to punish students for personal grievances. His treatment of Harry, in particular, is not simply about enforcing discipline or maintaining order in the classroom. It is a manifestation of his deep-seated hatred for Harry, a hatred that stems from the boy's very existence as the son of James Potter, Snape's childhood rival. Snape's bitterness towards Harry colours every interaction, and his personal vendetta turns the classroom into an arena for his emotional warfare. In the films, this animosity is hinted at but never fully explored. In the books, however, it is clear that Snape's vendetta goes far beyond the surface. His constant belittling of Harry is a reflection of his inability to move past his own past traumas and grudges. This deeply personal animosity is not just a flaw in Snape's character. It directly impacts his role as an educator and his ability to teach in any meaningful way. The films, however, offer a far more sympathetic portrayal of Snape's teaching. They depict his strictness as a necessary discipline for the students, framing his harshness as a means of preparing them for the challenges ahead, especially in light of the looming threat of Voldemort. This interpretation conveniently overlooks the fact that Snape's harshness is not about discipline or preparing students for the real world. It is about exercising control and power over them. His teaching is not an empowering force. It is a tool of emotional manipulation. The portrayal of Snape in the films is one of the most significant changes from the books, as the films attempt to erase the deeply damaging aspect of his personality in favor of a more palatable and redemptive figure. Take the lesson where Harry, Ron, and Hermione find themselves brewing a potion under Snape's watchful eye. In the film, the scene is intense, but ultimately feels more like an exciting, action-filled moment, with Snape's critiques serving as a backdrop to Harry's developing abilities. In the book, however, Snape's reaction to Harry brewing is nothing short of cruel. He publicly humiliates Harry, accusing him of being incompetent and clumsy. This type of behavior is not merely a reflection of Snape's strictness. it's an example of how he uses his authority to crush any sense of self-worth in his students. The films, in their effort to make Snape a more sympathetic character, fail to showcase the psychological toll this has on Harry and the other students who constantly face Snape's criticism. This portrayal of Snape as a misunderstood teacher is also reflected in the way the films deal with the aftermath of his actions. In the books, Snape's students frequently talk about how they suffered in his class. The emotional scars left by his constant criticism and disdain are apparent in the way characters like Neville carry themselves throughout the series. Yet the films give little weight to these emotional repercussions. Instead, the films focus on the dramatic aspects of Snape's character, such as his mysterious role as a double agent or his tragic love for Lily Potter, which are undeniably important but do not absolve him of his failings as a teacher. In the books, the emotional impact of Snape's actions is far more visceral. One of the most poignant examples of this is Neville's final moment in the Battle of Hogwarts, where he steps up as a hero facing his own fears and self-doubt. This act of bravery is in part a direct result of the way Snape had treated him over the years, but also a sign of how Neville ultimately overcame the emotional and psychological damage Snape had inflicted on him. In the films, however, Neville's growth is portrayed without the depth of his earlier struggles. The films focus more on his bravery in the face of danger rather than the emotional wounds he carries from years of abuse in Snape's classroom. The films, in their attempt to simplify Snape's character for cinematic purposes, choose to omit or downplay his more negative quality as a teacher. Snape's pedagogical failures are minimized, leaving a version of the character that is more heroic, more sympathetic, and, ultimately, more palatable to the audience. In doing so, the films miss the opportunity to fully explore the complexity of Snape's role as a teacher and the true emotional cost of his behavior. Ultimately, Snape's failures as an educator are one of the most telling aspects of his character. They serve as a stark reminder that even those who may later redeem themselves can cause real harm in the lives of others. In the films, this aspect of Snape's character is sacrificed for the sake of his redemption arc. The harsh truth of Snape's actions, particularly his treatment of students like Harry, Neville, and Hermione, is glossed over, leaving behind a portrayal of a teacher who, while strict and mysterious, is ultimately misunderstood. The films may have focused on his moments of heroism, but in doing so, they erased the true cost of his role as an educator, leaving a character who, in many ways, remained unexamined and unchallenged in the most important area of his life. Number 23. Erased line of betrayal toward Dumbledore. In the Harry Potter series, Severus Snape's character arc has always been shrouded in complexity and mystery. Initially, the films present Snape as a cold, calculating professor, seemingly aligned with the forces of darkness. However, as the story progresses, the films attempt to blur the lines between good and evil, especially regarding Snape's true loyalties. A key example of this attempt, to quote 60, Snape can be seen in the scene from quote 61, when Snape learns of Harry Potter's impending death. In the movie, he reacts emotionally, angrily, exclaiming, "He's 62." The audience is led to believe that Snape, in that moment, is genuinely outraged by Dumbledore's manipulation and the cruel fate awaiting Harry. However, this depiction diverges significantly from J.K. Rowling's original portrayal in the book series, where Snape's understanding of the situation was far more calculated and his reaction far more staged. In the films, this scene is framed as a pivotal emotional outburst, a revelation that snatches away Snape's icy facade, leaving the audience with the impression that Snape is the lone figure standing up against the grim inevitability of Harry's death. However, in the books, Snape is aware of Harry's fate long before this confrontation. He knew Dumbledore's plan from the very beginning, and his agreement to it was not born out of compassion or moral opposition, but rather out of his commitment to fulfilling Dumbledore's will. Snape was not shocked by the news of Harry's death. He had been complicit in the plan for months. He agreed to it because it was a necessary sacrifice for the greater good, the ultimate battle between good and evil. The film's alteration of this moment softens Snape's character, framing him as more sympathetic and morally conflicted than the original book portrayal would suggest. This change in the film is crucial in understanding how the adaptation alters Snape's arc for the sake of emotional drama. In the book, Snape's agreement to the plan is not the result of some sudden moral awakening, but part of a much darker and more tragic commitment. He was, in fact, playing a role all along, performing an act of loyalty that was necessary for the success of Dumbledore's long-term strategy. To make Snape's character more emotionally compelling and morally ambiguous, the films eliminate the crucial detail that Snape knew about Harry's destiny from the start. This shift in characterization is one of the most significant changes between the book and the film, as it rewrites Snape as moral alignment, making him appear more righteous and conflicted than he truly was. The emotional weight of Snape's reaction to Harry's death in the films is also compounded by the dramatic soundtrack and cinematography, which paint him as the most tragic figure in the room. In the book, however, Snape's emotional reactions are muted, and his commitment to the plan is a reflection of his guilt, personal pain, and sense of duty. The audience in the movie is led to believe that Snape's emotional outburst is genuine, a sign of his deep affection for Harry, a boy he had come to care for despite their contentious relationship. But in the books, Snape's feelings for Harry are far more complex and self-serving. He does not act out of love for Harry, but rather out of a profound sense of responsibility to Dumbledore, a man he had loved and whose memory he sought to honor. Snape's decision to protect Harry was driven by guilt over Lily Potter's death, and while he may have come to care for Harry over time, his actions were primarily motivated by the promise he made to Dumbledore. This distinction is made even clearer when we consider the way Snape's relationship with Dumbledore is portrayed in both versions. In the books, Snape is far more calculating, always operating under the assumption that he must maintain his cover as a loyal Death Eater, while secretly working for the Order of the Phoenix. His betrayal of Dumbledore, which the films later portray as a tragic necessity, is much more deliberate and less emotionally fraught in the books. Snape is a man who understands the larger picture but is deeply scarred by the personal losses he has suffered. The films, on the other hand, lean heavily into the idea that Snape's loyalty to Dumbledore was motivated by a deep, unspoken love for Lily Potter, and that his eventual role as a double agent was an act of redemption. This shift in the portrayal of Snape's character is a direct result of the film's need to simplify complex moral dilemmas into more digestible narratives of redemption and sacrifice. In the climactic scene where Snape confides in Harry after Dumbledore Ishwari's death, the films go even further to paint Snape as the ultimate tragic hero. The moment in the book where Snape reveals the truth about his actions and feelings to Harry is a carefully constructed moment of revelation that serves to strip away Snape's carefully guarded persona. In the movie, this scene is treated as the emotional climax of Snape's arc, the moment when he is revealed as both a protector and a villain, forcing Harry to understand that his actions were driven by a deep, abiding love for Lily and a commitment to protect Harry. But this reading of the character is oversimplified, and the film's attempt to redeem Snape at the last moment removes much of the ambiguity that makes him such a fascinating character in the books. Snape was not motivated solely by love or a desire to protect. His actions were always more complicated, driven by guilt, duty, and a sense of personal loss. Snape's death in the films is another key moment that differs greatly from the book's portrayal. In the movies, Snape's final moments are framed as a poignant, noble sacrifice, one that confirms his true loyalty to Harry and the wizarding world. The scene is designed to leave the audience with a sense of closure, as Snape dies a hero, his true nature revealed to the world. However, in the book, Snape's death is a tragic, almost anticlimactic moment. His last words, "Look at me," are a desperate plea for Harry to see the truth about his love for Lily, but they are not the selfless declaration of heroism that the film portrays. The book version of Snape's death is more tragic because it is a culmination of his inner conflict and personal torment, not the result of some heroic self-sacrifice. Snape dies knowing that he will never be fully understood or redeemed, and this is what makes his death more poignant in the book. In the film, however, this moment is portrayed as a final act of heroism, a fitting end for a character who, until the end, was a pawn in a much larger game. By softening Snape's character and making him more emotionally relatable, the films create a much more palatable narrative for the audience. In the books, Snape is a deeply flawed and morally ambiguous figure whose actions are often driven by personal motives and a desire to atone for his past. His ultimate redemption is not the result of his love for Lily Potter or his affection for Harry, but rather the culmination of his sense of duty and guilt. The films, however, transform him into a tragic hero whose actions are seen as selfless and motivated by love, an interpretation that is far more emotionally satisfying but less true to the character as originally conceived. The portrayal of Snape in the films also raises questions about the broader theme of morality in the Harry Potter series. The films often take a more black and white approach to the characters' moral alignments, particularly when it comes to Snape and Dumbledore. In the books, however, the moral complexity of these characters is much more nuanced, and their actions are driven by a deep sense of personal conflict. The films attempt to reconcile this complexity by presenting Snape as a figure caught between good and evil, but in doing so they oversimplify his character and his motivations. The result is a portrayal of Snape that is more heroic and less morally ambiguous than in the books, ultimately reducing the complexity of his character and the moral questions surrounding his actions. Through these changes, the films ultimately reshape Snape's character to fit the narrative of redemption and self-sacrifice, simplifying the moral ambiguity that defines his true nature in the books. By turning Snape into a tragic hero, the films diminish the complexity of his role in the larger story, and in doing so, they miss the opportunity to explore the darker, more tragic aspects of his character that made him one of the most compelling figures in the Harry Potter series. Number 24, omitted humiliations of other teachers. Severus Snape, the enigmatic potions master of Hogwarts, is a character whose depiction varies greatly between J.K. Rowling's books and their film adaptations. While the novels painted Snape as a deeply flawed and often cruel figure, the films took a different approach, smoothing out his rough edges and leaving out many of the darker nuances that made his character so complex. One of the most notable differences lies in his interactions with colleagues, particularly how he treated his fellow teachers. In the books, Snape's toxic behavior extended far beyond his relationships with students, and yet much of this is absent from the films. Instead, audiences are presented with a more neutral, almost sympathetic figure, one who, though still stern, appears to hold himself above the fray. This revision of Snape's character in the films makes him seem more noble than he truly is, often glossing over his deeper flaws and the petty cruelties he inflicted on his peers. In the novels, Severus Snape's behavior towards his colleagues is nothing short of condescending and at times downright spiteful. His relationship with Sybil Trelawney, the divination teacher, is one of the most glaring examples of his cruelty. Snape often mocks Trelawney, belittling her prophecies and making her the subject of his scorn. This is particularly evident during the events of Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, when Snape is described as having no patience for Trelawney, his eccentricities, and false predictions. He humiliates her not only in front of the students, but also in private, reinforcing the idea that he views her as insignificant and inferior. In the film adaptation, however, Snape's interactions with Trelawney are far less hostile. While he still exhibits some disdain for her, the sharpness and mockery that characterize their relationship in the books are noticeably muted. The films focus more on Snape, his role as a teacher, omitting much of the cruelty he shows towards his colleagues. Similarly, Snape's attitude towards Rubeus Hagrid, the beloved care of magical creatures professor, is another example of his toxic behavior. In Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, Snape openly mocks Hagrid, his abilities as a teacher, dismissing his students' admiration for him as foolishness. He seems to take pleasure in belittling Hagrid, as knowledge and abilities, even going so far as to make disparaging remarks about Hagrid's large, half-giant heritage. The contempt that Snape holds for Hagrid is evident throughout the series, with Snape repeatedly undermining Hagrid's authority. In the films, however, Snape's animosity towards Hagrid is largely downplayed. While their rivalry is hinted at, the films rarely explore the depth of Snape's disdain for Hagrid. Instead, the character is portrayed as a more neutral figure, simply having a tense, professional relationship with Hagrid rather than one filled with open contempt. Perhaps one of the most telling examples of Snape's cruelty towards his colleagues comes from his treatment of Nymphadora Tonks, the young and optimistic Auror. In Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, Snape's disdain for Tonks reaches a particularly cruel moment when he mocks her for the change in her Patronus, a sign of her unrequited love for Remus Lupin. Snape's response is callous, reducing Tonks to the butt of his jokes and showing an utter lack of empathy for her feelings. He doesn't just mock her, he openly revels in her discomfort. This act of cruelty is not merely a product of Snape's normal prickliness. It is an example of his deep-seated bitterness and his tendency to lash out at those he perceives as weaker or beneath him. The film adaptation of Half-Blood Prince, however, portrays Snape's interactions with Tonks much more gently. While he still maintains a somewhat dismissive attitude towards her, the films gloss over the depth of his cruelty and the personal nature of his attacks. The mockery of Tonks, his Patronus, is barely mentioned, and the emotional weight of the moment is lost. Snape's behavior towards his fellow teachers is a reflection of the larger pattern of toxicity that he fosters throughout his life. He is a man who thrives on control and superiority, and his interactions with his colleagues demonstrate just how far he is willing to go to maintain that power. Whether it is his ruthless treatment of Trelawney, his condescending attitude towards Hagrid, or his cruel mockery of Tonks, Snape's actions in the books paint a picture of a man who is not only harsh, but deeply insecure. His need to belittle others is a defense mechanism, a way for him to assert dominance over those he deems weaker or more vulnerable. This behavior is emblematic of the darker aspects of his character that the films so often fail to explore. The film's portrayal of Snape is much more sanitized. Instead of the sharp, biting remarks that define his relationships with his colleagues in the books, the films give us a Snape who is less overtly cruel and more reserved. His interactions with others are often portrayed with a sense of distance and professionalism rather than the bitter hostility that is so evident in the novels. The filmmakers made a conscious decision to focus on Snape's more noble qualities, such as his loyalty to Dumbledore and his bravery in the face of danger. These aspects of Snape's character are certainly important, but they are not the full picture. By removing or downplaying his cruelty towards his colleagues, the films present an incomplete version of Snape, one that is easier to sympathize with, but ultimately less interesting and less true to the original source material. This decision to soften Snape's character in the films is part of a larger trend in adapting the Harry Potter series for the screen. Many of the more complex, morally ambiguous characters in the books are simplified for a broader audience. Snape's story in particular is one of transformation and redemption, but the path he takes to get there is messy and filled with moral compromises. In the films, however, Snape's transformation is portrayed as much more straightforward, with his earlier flaws and cruelties largely forgotten in the face of his eventual heroism. By omitting the depth of Snape's character flaws, his cruel treatment of colleagues, his bitterness, his emotional manipulation, the films risk undermining the complexity of his ultimate redemption. Severus Snape's character arc is one of the most compelling in the Harry Potter series, but it is also one of the most tragic. His journey from a bitter, resentful teacher to a tragic hero is a testament to the power of personal growth and the possibility of redemption. However, the film's portrayal of Snape's character arc, particularly in relation to his treatment of his colleagues, is incomplete. By omitting or downplaying the darker aspects of his personality, the films present a version of Snape that is more palatable but ultimately less true to the character in the books. In the novels, Snape's cruelty towards others is an essential part of his character, and it is only through confronting and overcoming these flaws that he is able to find redemption. The films, by focusing on Snape's more heroic traits, miss an opportunity to explore the full complexity of this fascinating character. The true tragedy of Severus Snape lies not just in his death, but in the way he lived his life. He was a man who constantly sought to prove himself, to elevate himself above others, and in doing so, he alienated those around him. His cruelty towards his colleagues was a manifestation of this need for control and power. In the films, this complexity is lost, and Snape's character becomes, in some ways, more one-dimensional. While he is still a compelling figure, his actions are lessened in significance because the films fail to fully capture the depth of his flaws. The Snape we see on screen is a hero, yes, but he is a hero who has been stripped of much of what made him so fascinating in the first place: his bitterness, his cruelty, and his internal struggle. Severus Snape's character in the Harry Potter films is a testament to the complexities of adaptation. While the films succeed in capturing the broad strokes of his character arc, they fall short in depicting the full range of his emotional and psychological struggles. By sanitizing his relationships with his colleagues and downplaying his more toxic traits, the films present a version of Snape that is easier to sympathize with, but ultimately less true to the character in the books. The result is a portrayal of Snape that is both less complex and less satisfying than the one found in J.K. Rowling's novels. Number 25, Silence about his disdain for Muggles. Severus Snape is one of the most complex and layered characters in the Harry Potter universe. The movies, however, made subtle but significant changes to his portrayal, particularly concerning his views on Muggles. In the films, Snape's earlier views, especially those aligning with pure-blood supremacy, are muted. The filmmakers chose to omit key aspects of Snape's character, leaving him less morally ambiguous and more of a tragic hero, misunderstood rather than irredeemable. The films transformed his background and earlier beliefs into mere mistakes or youthful errors in judgment, but this glossing over of Snape's past in the films overlooks the very real ideological choices he made, choices that were not accidental, but deeply ingrained in his youth. In the books, Severus Snape is presented as a man who, at one point, fervently embraced the ideology of Voldemort and the Death Eaters. He was drawn to their promises of power and superiority, especially when it came to the treatment of Muggles and Muggle-borns. Snape's disdain for Muggles wasn't a superficial dislike, it was rooted in a belief system that equated blood purity with worth. When he first uses the term mudblood in the books, it is not out of ignorance or a fleeting emotion, but from a place of ingrained prejudice. Snape, as a young man, was fully immersed in the philosophy of superiority that Voldemort espoused, viewing Muggles as beneath him. This aspect of Snape's character is introduced early in the books and builds throughout the series. The young Snape's interactions with Lily Evans, Harry's mother, provide crucial insight into his mindset. Lily's rejection of him, which stemmed from his increasingly sinister views, was not simply about personal animosity. She saw the dangerous direction in which Snape was heading, and it was his views on blood purity and Muggleborns that repelled her. As she told him, Snape's shift towards the dark arts, which included his disdain for Muggles, was a betrayal. The fact that Snape could call Lily a mudblood, a term laden with venom and hatred, was a clear sign of his alignment with Voldemort as ideology. In contrast to his portrayal in the films, Snape's contempt for Muggles was not a minor, occasional lapse in judgment, but a fundamental aspect of his character in the books. However, the films minimize this element of Snape's character. In the cinematic adaptations, the idea of Snape's deep-seated prejudice against Muggles is almost entirely erased. We never see him use the term blushed, quote, 73 on screen, and his hatred for Muggles is only lightly alluded to. This omission significantly alters his moral trajectory. Instead of Snape being someone who, at one point, made the conscious decision to align himself with a discriminatory ideology, he is portrayed as a man who made a mistake in his youth, a mistake that could be easily forgiven because he eventually changed or redeemed himself. By not addressing his early views more directly, the films effectively soften the impact of his choices. The most significant omission is the portrayal of Snape as a character who actively chose to follow Voldemort and his ideology. The films fail to emphasize that Snape was not merely a pawn in Voldemort's army, but someone who was drawn to the idea of wizarding supremacy. His later actions, such as switching allegiances, are framed as a redemption arc, but the films provide little context for how deeply embedded Snape's beliefs were in his character. In the book, Snape's eventual decision to become a double agent was not simply a rejection of Voldemort, but a result of his guilt over the loss of Lily Evans. He never truly renounced his earlier beliefs. His loyalty to Voldemort was replaced by a sense of duty to protect Harry, not a genuine ideological shift. Moreover, the films make Snape's feelings for Lily Evans seem like the primary reason for his turn against Voldemort. While his love for Lily is undoubtedly a crucial part of Snape as character, the films obscure the fact that Snape's choices were also influenced by his awareness of the oppressive, destructive force Voldemort represented. In the books, it is clear that Snape's eventual betrayal of Voldemort is less about pure love and more about a sense of justice, however twisted it may have been. His decision to act as a spy for Dumbledore was not simply motivated by a desire to redeem himself for the loss of Lily. It was also because he recognized the threat Voldemort posed to the wizarding world as a whole. Yet, this complexity is largely stripped away in the films, which instead focus on Snape as a tragic figure whose actions are portrayed primarily as a means to regain Lily's favor in some way. In essence, the films offer a more sanitized version of Snape's past. His prejudices are never shown to be a key part of his personal struggle. Instead, he is presented as a man who, despite his early associations with Voldemort and the Death Eaters, was always fundamentally good at heart. The films make it easier for viewers to accept Snape as character because they downplay the deeply problematic aspects of his past. By stripping away his earlier disdain for Muggles, the films make it easier for the audience to view him as a tragic hero rather than a man who actively engaged in harmful ideologies. This shift in portrayal is not without consequences. By erasing Snape as early bigotry, the films undermine the complexity of his redemption. His eventual role as a protector of Harry Potter becomes more of a simple hero, his journey, narrative, where he is a man seeking redemption for past mistakes. In the books, however, Snape's redemption is far more complicated. It is not a story of someone who simply changed his mind about blood purity. It is a story of someone who wrestled with the consequences of his earlier choices for the rest of his life. Snape's redemption arc is not just about moving away from Voldemort, but about facing the full weight of the harm he had caused, even if he didn't fully comprehend the depth of that harm at the time. The omission of Snape's views on Muggles also alters the way his actions are interpreted in the films. In the books, Snape's later efforts to protect Muggle-borns and his defiance of Voldemort's ideology are deeply tied to the remorse he feels for his earlier beliefs. These actions are not simply motivated by a desire to protect Harry, but also by a sense of responsibility for the ideology he once espoused. In the films, this is not as clearly communicated, Instead, Snape is portrayed more as a reluctant hero whose actions are based more on his personal relationship with Harry than on any genuine ideological shift.